It'll get noisy on this. Movement. Hops are something you hear about. The hop farms are really interesting things. Eating local beer culture. I mean, these are just ideas to pick from, and we will do those projects the last, no, not the last day of classes, our beer tasting competition, and then so the 2 days prior to the end of class. And there's also a day to run your topic by us to make sure that we aren't doing 5 stories in Sierra Nevada. Be a great one to do, but
you talk about their style.
Yes, their 5-minute presentation, and we'll sign up in the lab Friday for. We don't want 3 people doing stouts, and so once stouts taken, your group will have to pick something else.
Did you talk about field trips at all?
I have not said anything about field trips.
So we're gonna visit every brewery in Spartanburg.
Starting Wednesday.
Starting Wednesday, and on Wednesday we're gonna visit the downtown breweries, so RJ Rockers and Cyclops, and we're gonna walk. And so we're gonna walk because it saves us $200 in vans, and Dr. Arrington and I can drink then if we're walking. When we go to the other breweries and we're driving the vans, you won't see us touch any alcohol because that's the responsible thing to do, right? But we're gonna walk to RJ Rockers and Cyclops. We'll meet downstairs at 12:30 to do that. We're gonna go to Holiday. So let me just by a show of hands, how many people have been to RJ Rockers? How many people have been to Cyclops? Good. How many people have been to Holiday?
It's at Drink Mill.
Plank owner? Nobody. So I bet nobody's in a new group either. Oh, you have. We got a new group. All right. So those 2 are on Highway 9 in Bowling Springs. Has anyone been to Birds Fly South Ale Project in Greenville? We're going to go there. They do a lot of open fermentation in farmhouse in addition to regular beers, farmhouse beers. And we're also going to go to a new place, Think Tank Lab Brewing, that just opened this year. Has anyone ever been to White Labs in Asheville? Good. What about Sierra Nevada? Yeah, some people have been to Sierra Nevada. Okay, cool. So those are the breweries we're going to go to. And the thing is, especially with the Spartanburg breweries, each brewery has sort of its own identity. Yeah. And in terms of the kinds of beers that they like to brew, in terms of the atmosphere of the bar, not the tap room, that's the word I'm looking for. The tap room's like, right? And so I think hopefully you'll find that pretty interesting to sort of explore and say, hey, this is really an IPA brewery, or this is really a big boozy beer brewery.
We've got both of those.
We have both of those here. Okay. When we do the field trips, we're going to be tasting a lot of beer starting today. Pretty much every day we'll be tasting beer. But it's important that that we're responsible about that, especially when we go on these field trips. We have had the occasional person that overconsumed on a field trip, and that's not fun, and that's not a good thing. And so, also, I'll just say, I think I said this in our introductory meeting, because we're going to be around a lot of beer, the smell of beer, when we're making beer and drinking beer, it's important that you're not hungover as well from the night before. I know it's interim, and I know we're teaching a lot about beer, but you also need to be able to be in good spirits and present with us when you're here with us. You ready to start? You're up first.
Okay, yes. So today, I'm going to talk for a little bit about the brewing process, and then just taken from our book, The History of Beer, we'll take a little break, and I'll certainly say this several times. Brewing takes a long time, and interim is a very short time, so we have to start right away. In fact, even today, we will start the yeast that you're going to use tomorrow multiplying so that they can start fermenting right away in your beers. So the big brewing that you do will be Tuesday, and then a large batch Thursday, and then you'll brew again on the 20th, the recipe of your brew, of your creation.
Yeah, that's another thing that we should probably mention is that we are going to have you create your own beer, your own recipe. So be thinking about that starting now. You know, what kind of style, what kind of flavor profile, and we will when we're brewing on Tuesday, tomorrow, and Thursday. That's a great time to ask us questions about, hey, I'd like to do a peanut butter banana stout. How would I do that, right? Or that sort of thing, because those are times that we are available and we have downtime and we can have those kinds of talks. So don't wait till the last minute to start sort of thinking about what kind of creation of beer you want to do. Everybody will create a recipe. Then we're going to group you by types of recipes, like, oh, these 3 people all want to do a stout. So y'all get together and pick one of the 3 recipes or merge them together in some way. So everybody won't be able to make their recipe because we don't have enough time or equipment, but we'll group you into, what do we say, 8 groups? 6 groups?
Yeah, 8 groups of 3, maybe.
Okay, maybe 8 groups of 3.
Yeah,
You know,
be pushing our equipment, but I think that's what we'll do.
okay.
I do a very important job. Stand up and mash the button that's up. It looks like a super secret black button. Hold it down for a count of 4. 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004. Perfect.
That's 4.
Yeah.
There you go.
Excellent. The wonderful thing that Ike's done also is he set up a timer. That's going to cut back on in half an hour, and hopefully I'll be close to being done. So when that kicks on, you can say, oh good, he's about to wrap up. Actually, I have no idea how long this is going to take. But I'll be in a half hour, 40 minutes. John, how likely is that?
Pretty likely.
Yeah, John is great. Okay, what is beer? Obviously alcoholic, but a drink made from fermented cereal grains. And cereal grains, there are lots of them. There's, you would think of anything that makes bread, wheat, barley, but rice is a cereal grain, oats are a cereal grain, anything that we put in that, that category. Beer is, partially because it's so old, it's a super simple, say something richer to drink, but it's a super simple drink. It only has 4 ingredients. The cereal grains, and this word malted, I wish I had underlined it because malting means something really specific that we'll have to talk about. But if you've had a malted milkshake, that distinct flavor that makes a malted chocolate milkshake taste different than just a chocolate milkshake, that's that same process of malting. And we'll talk a lot about what that does, so I really wish I underlined malted. And then, honestly, beer is almost entirely water, and so water is a super important aspect of beer. And when we tour Sierra Nevada, they will talk about all the work they had to do to move their manufacturing from Chico, California to Asheville. It turns out a lot of the minerals that are in the water in California aren't present in Asheville, and they have to add in to get the same water profile. In fact, Holiday Brewing is really particular about their water chemistry. Hops, I'm sure you've probably heard of as part of the beer. It's it's a flour, but adds the bitterness and aroma to most beers. And then finally, what makes beer alcoholic is yeast. And really, these 4 ingredients, but in a multitude of combinations, make all the varieties of beer. Beer, of course, has been around for a long, long time, and the Germans probably get more recognition as brewers than any other country, but the Reinheitsgebot is the German purity law, which says the only ingredients used for the brewing of beer must be barley, hops, and water. And if you do anything else, it can be a drink you sell, but you just can't call it beer. And this is, this comes from the late Middle Ages in beer. Hey, I put up 4 ingredients here, but the Reinskapel only lists those. What's missing? Yeast. In the 1500s, we just didn't know about yeast as a necessary ingredient. In fact, they knew that the old beer needed to be added to the new beer, and what they were doing is adding yeast unbeknownst to them into their new beer that they were making. So yeast as an ingredient really doesn't come along until the 1800s, where we realized that growing fungus is important for the fermentation of beer. So fermentation, that's the principal reaction of beer. And so I'm a chemist and I've got to put up a chemical equation, but you all sat through your 10th grade chemistry at some point, and you remember chemical reactions where the stuff I'm starting with, in this case glucose, and then that arrow means turns into, and that's what happens during fermentation. And it produces ethanol and carbon dioxide. So beers tend to be carbonate, self-carbonated, because of the reaction that produces alcohol. Yeast does all this work for us only because it wants this energy so that it can reproduce. It can make new yeast cells. It needs that energy for its metabolism, and it's the consumption of the sugar. They really could care less about those other bits, and yeast is just doing this because it wants the energy. Yeast is not a bacteria, it's really a fungus, but it's a single-celled organism that does this reaction very effectively. There are a whole bunch of fermented drinks where it's this reaction that's taking place, and what changes is the source of the sugar. So beer, we said, the sugars from grains, that produces beer. Let me do a couple of others of these with you that I bet you'll know most of them. If the sugars comes from grapes and we ferment it, what do we call it? Wine, absolutely. Cider, terrific. If rice produces the sugar, what do we call it? Not Bud Light, but oops, say it? Sake, absolutely. If honey produces the sugar, Dr. Pittman said this earlier. Mead, yes. And then now we can get weird, there are cultures that have lots of bananas, and so banana sugars. Who knew? I didn't know this. This is why Wikipedia is so wonderful. Pronto is a South American drink where the sugars come from bananas. Corn sugars. Yeah, it is true. Bourbon comes from corn sugars. In bourbon, more than 50% of the sugars have to come from corn sugars. But they've done something extra for bourbons in distilling it. If you just do fermentation, it's a Central American drink called chicha. And then the manic root is a root that apparently grows in Africa. And nihamanichi is the fermented drink that when the sugars come from manic roots. In fact, this list really is much longer than this. So we've been fermenting sugars for a long, long time, running this reaction. So we will do the brewing process over and over again. Most of the images that I will show in here come from the Encyclopedia Britannica's page on this, and I think it's actually particularly good. So malting. If we're going to make beer, barley is the grain that produces most of the sugars in craft brewing. And the problem is these are just seeds, and seeds are ready to grow and produce a new plant. And they have a lot of energy stored in them. but it's not stored as sugar. It's stored as cellulose and carbohydrates, so long-chain sugars that yeast can't do anything with. And so the process of malting is kind of cool. You take the seed and let the seed begin to germinate. You can see the plant beginning to grow. And in the process of germination, the cellulose that's in the seed gets broken down to carbohydrates that the seed can now use for growth. And so if you just took grains and didn't do anything with them, there would be no accessible sugars for the yeast to start. So the process of malting is letting the seed begin to germinate, and once it has germinated for a period of time, those inaccessible cellulose big molecules get broken down into carbohydrates that the seed would then use to start growing. But we kill the germination by heating it. So this is in an oven called kilning, and all this takes place in a malt house. And you've broken down these inaccessible large molecules into smaller carbohydrates, and then you grind them up in a milling machine. So that word that I said I wish I'd underlined, malting, is an important step in getting the sugars out of the grain. And so all sugars need to be malted, otherwise you can't, all grains need to be malted, otherwise you can't get to the sugars. And of course the stuff I said is now there. Grains get roasted to different amounts. You can see some dark roasting, which will make a darker beer, and light roasting that of course makes lighter beer. And then these are the grains that you'll be using cracked open as we start brewing. Okay.
Can I
Yes.
say something real quick? So Dr. Arrington mentioned a malt house, but all the breweries essentially buy their malt, their grain, at that end process after it's been, well, rolled or at least kilned, right? Sometimes they might crush their own grains because it's cheaper.
Sure, yeah, they're crushing.
But so there are malt houses. We tried to schedule one of our field trips to a malt house in Asheville, and we couldn't work that out. But you know, that whole process of malting is a whole different industry, right, from brewing, and that grain, then the breweries buy that grain. Even the big guys like Sierra Nevada buy their grains already malted from a malt house. That process and the hop cultivation, creation of the hops process are really two separate industries that the breweries buy ingredients from.
That's exactly right. So where the brewer gets involved, there's a picture of the cold crushed grains. Currently, little chemistry. That represents a glucose molecule. Two glucose molecules together is a sucrose molecule, and a large carbohydrate is the yeast of these. Yeasts can only eat glucose and sucrose. Yeasts are just collections of enzymes that can't interact with these large carbohydrates. And so the first step is to break these carbohydrates down into these smaller sugars. And that process is called mashing, where you take the grains in, it just looks like oatmeal. You can picture runny oatmeal. That is held at a temperature of about 150 Fahrenheit, and just the enzymes present in the grains start breaking that down. I mean, the seed, you know, what it was, would want to use these sugars to grow. We killed the seed though, so we're going to steal those sugars in order to produce beer. So you will do this process on Thursday, collecting the sugars, and it'll smell sweet. You can really smell those sugars. And they'll sit for about an hour at 155 degrees, and these long carbohydrates will break apart into smaller sugars. But this is a mess. This is totally gunky. And of course, they're just any disciplines just have words that describe really specific processes, but separating the sugar water from all that spent grain is called watering. I think you may get to see some of that at RJ Rockers. At Rockers, they'll be brewing bell ringer on the day we go, and the brewer Jeremy will have. You may get to see this process happening. Once the sugar water, this is oatmeal. Pour off just the water, and now you just have sweet liquid that you're going to boil for a couple of reasons. You're going to boil to sterilize, kill any bacteria that's part of the grains, and you're going to add hops. And so here's a picture of the sugar water boiling. I've got to give you so there's a word for separating liquid from grains, and there's a word for sugar water in brewing. But you can see here's the sugar water, and then the hops are sitting on top. Hops produce that bitterness, and the longer hops are at an elevated temperature, the more bitter compounds they can produce. So, yeah, and this is really where we will start our work tomorrow. So there was a word for separating water from grains, and the sugar water that you produce, I did finally underline. That sugar water is called wort. It's a funny name, I think, but you'll get used to saying it. Don't let your wort boil over if you'll be saying, keep an eye on the wort as you're boiling. So this is called the wort, and it's the extracted sugars from the grains now with the hops present to give it the distinctive character that those hops are going to give. So after you boiled, you sterilized the beer, you've extracted the flavorings from hops, you've broken apart large proteins, you're ready to ferment, but you can't add yeast to boiling water because you will kill your yeast immediately. So this is a step that will take a while in the lab. You've got to go from boiling 212 Fahrenheit down to 70. And before you can put the yeast in, and of course there's a word for putting the yeast in, and that word is to pitch. That means to add yeast to wort, sugar water, and there's lots of cooling. You look for this cooling at RJ Rockers. It's a big two-flow cooling fan. We will do cooling with coils in the lab, and then finally. Fermentation, this is an industrial fermentation tank. Rockers have some that look similar to that. Here's sort of the fermentation that we're going to do in glass jars. And notice this, so another important word, pitching, means adding the yeast to the wort. You will put in about a tablespoon worth of yeast, but in 2 weeks, your fermentation will have probably 2 cups of yeast, because all yeast is doing is reproducing itself. The byproducts of the reproduction interest humans, but yeast is just doing its fermentation to make more yeast. Another verb, flocculation is the term for dormant yeast sticking together, and if you want a clear beer, you want to use yeast that flocculate very strongly. If you want a hazy IPA, they pick yeast that don't flocculate very well and stay suspended in solution. So the clarifying of beer, we like clean, crisp beers in many instances, and so we let the yeast settle to the bottom and then pull the clean beer off the top, leave the yeast behind, and let it clarify and mature in what's referred to as the bright tank. You'll hear brewers talk about where their bright tank is in many of the places that we go. The bright means to make clear. And then finally, the last thing to do is to carbonate the beer. That's called conditioning. And there's 2 ways to carbonate beer. One is to let yeast continue fermenting sugars, but with the bottle capped, and that produces carbon dioxide that can't escape and dissolves into the beer. And we will do, actually we'll do both these types. You will do bottle conditioning of your beer where the fermentation process makes the carbon dioxide that gets trapped. And the other is forced carbonation. We have kegs in the lab where we have carbon dioxide tanks that we can force the carbon dioxide into the beer. Wow. So the first question on your first quiz is the following. Getting used to the vocabulary. Brewers make wort, but yeast makes the beer. All we do as brewers is make the sugar water that is flavored with hops and grains to our specifications, and then it's the yeast that converts that sugar into beer. So that's the first question that you're going to be asked. So there are really two distinct types of home brewing, and that's to brew with the grains, which we will do on Thursday, or to let someone else do the mash step that makes the sugar water, and then you can purchase the extract. So this is the sugar water where almost all the water has been boiled out, and you just have this sweet, almost molasses consistency. But that came from someone doing the mash. Or you can let it dry out completely and then crush it in a roller and make malted sugar. And some of you have kits for tomorrow that will start with the malted sugar, and some have liquid extract. So we will do this extract brewing on Tuesday and the full mash brewing on Thursday. And so these are just sugars from barley, and this is sort of molasses from barley. All right, beer history. Well under that half an hour, not well under, but under enough. I'm just going to run through the bits that you've already read from this. I think it's so interesting that it's worth doing. So, anyone sociology, anthropology majors? So civilization. Why do we land with civilization? There are lots of reasons that we stopped being hunter-gatherers and started living communally. But one thing's for sure is we couldn't have produced fermented drinks while still moving around. In civilization, fermented drinks require stationary locations that you have to let the soaking of grains, you can't be moving around and doing that. So early civilization is linked to about the same time people settled down, fermented drinks started appearing. This location in Turkey is the oldest archaeological site where remnants of fermented beverages are found. But if you just taste grains that haven't been malted, they may be nutritious, but they are not tasting. Our receptors for sugars can't pick up any sugars in these grains, and it's not until they sat in water that those sugars, that sweet sugar came out. You'll be able to taste those sugar grains, and they really taste, I think, pretty good. So civilization and beer making really go hand in hand. The oldest recovered beer comes from China, almost, 8,000 years ago. China had very active breweries. They're, of course, using the grains of rice, and there's no such thing as hops at this point. They're just using honey and fruits to make fermented vegetables. Egyptian cultures were very, have detailed beer recipes and had breweries, and really knew much more about yeasts than Northern Europe knows about yeast. So the Egyptians were on their game. In fact, they paid laborers in beer. The Greek and Roman cultures weren't very interested in beer, largely because grapes grow so well in that Mediterranean climate, and wines have lots of advantages over beers. Their higher alcohol content of wines means that you can store wines for long periods. Beers really can't be stored very long at all. The Northern Europeans are, in fact, I mean, they're not even really a culture during the Roman and Greek empires, but those barbarians did drink beer because grains could be grown in Northern Europe. But they did introduce beer barrels. So we know that wine matures in casks, but those wooden casks originally come from beer storage. So as we move to, European history, the medieval period in Europe is characterized for me by filth. Any picture of the Middle Ages, I just see mud and dirt, and people lived fairly squalid lives and had no idea what bacteria was. And as people moved to larger and larger cities, London and Paris are just a pit, a cesspit. They didn't know to get rid of their sewage. And beer is basically one of the few things you can drink without getting sick, because you have to boil the water in beer, and that of course killed all the bacteria. The folks didn't know why it was, but beer was a safe drink to have. Alewife comes from that time. Preparing the beer for the house was really viewed as women's work. Up until beer making was women's work for the greatest history of beer. It wasn't really until the Industrial Revolution and people started making a lot of money off of it, and then became involved in the production of beer. All beer was local in the Middle Ages. You couldn't ship it any distance at all without spoiling. And in the Middle Ages, hops are not an ingredient. Beer was flavored with something called Brewing. Brewing was spices of the landscape, spruce, juniper. But of course, people can't help but tax. Beer was taxed, but it actually wasn't the beer that was taxed. The church taxed the brewing because it was a smaller portion, I guess. But the amount of brewing that a brewer used, tax had to be paid on that. Hops comes into Germany fairly early, around 1000 AD, but doesn't make it to England, for another 600 years. But here, hop farms in Europe, and these are telephone poles in height, and so hops grow up very long poles. We'll look more at hops later in the course and see some hop farms in Oregon and Washington, but they're massive plants. Here's the hop plant in a book from the Middle Ages. But hops do something other than make beer taste better. There are antimicrobial oils in hops that allow beer to not spoil so quickly. So beer went from having a shelf life of a few weeks to having a shelf life of several months. And the Dutch finally start putting beer in barrels and putting it on ships and sending it out to colonies so that expatriates living in other climates could drink beer. But it made it a commercial quantity entity that could be traded and sold. So by the end of the Middle Ages, hop is hit, brewing is done, and the Reinskoppel of 1516, it said, hey, hops has to be part of the deal, and it was. Pubs, public houses, is where beer was available. People didn't drink very much at home. And of course, all of the discussion of the Enlightenment takes place in these pubs. And so the public house was where these ideas of democracy and growth out of the Middle Ages takes place in these public houses. Shakespeare spent a lot of time in his public house. So we moved from the Enlightenment, as part of the Enlightenment, moving into industrialization, and industrialization was very good for beer. Being able to use thermometers to measure temperature and the manufacturing of sterile vessels, all of that led to much better tasting beer through, well, and also the printing press. I mean, once you get recipes sent out, you can make the same beer again and again. So early industrialization was very good for beer production. Industrialization really hurt beer sales in one way, the new technology of distillation. So beer is fermented, but all distilled spirits are essentially taking fermented beer and then boiling the alcohol off, so to concentrate the alcohol away from the beer. Most beers are 95% water, 5% alcohol, but with the still, you can make a drink that is 40% alcohol, 60% water, and that has a lot of advantages. The shelf life is very long. You don't have to carry barrels of it. A bottle of bourbon is the same as carrying cases and cases of beer in terms of total alcohol. So here's a picture of a men's club where they've just gone totally crazy drinking gin. The English loved their gin. In the U.S., whiskey and bourbon were very popular. There's my half hour. So yeah, 10 more minutes. If you're loading up a wagon to travel west, you can't put a beer barrel on it. That's just too heavy. But a barrel of whiskey will last you a long time. So distilled spirits do become very popular in the 1700s. I love this picture. Let's see, John, you're kind of close enough to see. Here are two pictures. One titled Beer Street and one entitled Gin Lane. Look at the Gin Lane pictures. How well is this mother taking care of this baby? Not so well. This person's practically a skeleton. They really, London particularly, just saw gin as an evil where mothers would ignore children, husbands would leave home. But this beer street is a productive, there's loads of fishes and healthy artists taking place, and the idea that beer is this healthy drink that can be part of the community, and that distilled liquor is just the devastation of the community is what the artist is showing in these two contrasting images. So, two big changes in beers. In Shakespeare time, almost all beers we would consider porters, dark beers that are in killing the grains. They're doing these in fires, and those fires are making for dark grains that produces dark beers. A big change to the clean, golden beer that we now think of today comes from, it's not until the 1870s that we have our first microscope that can really look and see yeast molecules. But there are two strains of yeast that distinguish the two principal different types of beer. We have ales, and that's made by the yeast strain Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And then in the 1850s, a new strain of yeast there are 500 strains of yeast, but there are two big distinction types. They're both Saccharomyces, but Pastorianus is the lager yeast. Lager yeasts ferment much slower at their optimum temperature is low temperatures, and they don't produce very many other flavors. They just primarily convert sugars into alcohol. Ale yeasts produce a lot of butter, banana, cinnamon flavors. And in fact, we will let you taste beers that are the exact same beer, but just made with different yeasts, and get a flavor for what type of yeasts can produce flavors just on their own. But so everything was ale yeast. And it wasn't until the northern German countries sort of stumbled upon this Pastorianus that makes for much cleaner, crisper beers. And so the lager is introduced in the 1850s, and that's kind of the difference between lager and ale. There are lots of other distinctions that we can talk about, but that is a really big difference. I love these numbers. So these are breweries in Germany. 1860, there are 135 lager breweries, and that's about 30%. By the 1870s, Germany has just fallen in love with lagers. Almost 98% of all beers produced in Germany are those German lagers. But I think you should think of St. Pauli Girl, Beck's, Heineken, all of those are of that lager type. It really was the fastest change in an industry ever. In a decade, lagering just became, it just defines what a German beer is. Lager is the German word for storage because these beers have to be stored for a very long time. The beers that we drink mostly, American beers are a type of lager, the Pilsner lager, but all of these, Corona is, of course, Mexican, Sapporo is Japanese, Heineken is Dutch, Lavazza is Canadian, and Budweiser and Michelob are U.S., but all of these are Pilsner beers. The first lager Pilsner comes out of Czechoslovakia, Pilsner Urquell, and I really wanted to bring this beer for y'all to taste, but I couldn't. Maybe we'll get some before we're done. But this is sort of the beer that leads into the modern, Natty Light is another Pilsner lager. All right, so I just said industrialization was great for beer. Being able to do things reproducibly was great. The latter part of the 20th century was terrible for beer. I love this plot. So this is 1890, 1887. There are 2,000 breweries in the U.S. And as time goes on, the number of breweries decrease. In fact, goes to zero here. Oh, I wish that wasn't there. I want to ask you what's happened. Why are there no breweries in the U.S.? We outlawed alcohol over a 30-year period with the 18th Amendment that prevented the production of alcohol, and then the 21st Amendment that repealed the 18th Amendment. So 13 years of prohibition. The breweries, they didn't go away, they just did other things. They made sodas, and then they were food manufacturing facilities that stuck around. This blows me away though. So in 1979, we are down to 89 breweries in the country, only 44 companies that are making beer, and these are Miller, Schlitz, Pabst, all of those are German people, by the way, who came over here. And those beers, they are all making the exact same beer, and it is as cheap as they can make it. They're making it with a lot of corn sugar. It would not meet the Reinstgewolt purity law. We're making really terrible beer at this point. But that was their market. In fact, from the time of Prohibition, making beer at home is illegal all the way up until 1979. Jimmy Carter signs a law that allows home brewing to continue. And in Alabama, it remains illegal to home brew until 2012. But you can see, once home brewing starts, the number of breweries climbs. This is 2012, there are 2,400. We're now sitting up here at more than 9,000 breweries in the U.S. It's been a decade of craft beer craziness. All right, I promised you 10 minutes. These are some important people of craft brewing.
You should talk about that. That's good.
Well, there's some important people. Ken Grossman is the founder of Sierra Nevada. He's just a home brewer that his friends like his stuff, and so in California in 1980, he introduces the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. Quite honestly, a beer that every time I have a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, I'm just in awe of how good that beer is. Sam Adams on the East Coast is started in Boston by Jim Koch 4 years later. The Fritz Maytag story is pretty good. Fritz Maytag, this is Maytag washing machines and refrigerators. He's the fourth, I think, Maytag. He likes a beer produced by the Anchor Steam Company, Anchor Brewing, and the beer is Anchor Steam. And he hears that that company is going to go bankrupt, it's going to go out of business, and he buys Anchor Steam in order to keep making it. And this is sort of really one of the, it's a craft beer before craft beers take place. Charlie Papazian wrote the book, The Complete Joy of Home Brewing, which all of these people, he writes that in 1984, so he is part of bringing that craft brewing to people. He has a magazine called Synergy out in Boulder, Colorado. So a few things. What is it to be a craft beer? First, the term first appears in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, a specialty beer produced in limited quantities. Sam Adams produces 4 million barrels of beer. A barrel of beer is 30 gallons of beer. And basically the definition of how big a brewery can be before it's not a craft brewery, however much Sam Adams makes, it's just below whatever the current definition of what a craft brewery can be. Actually, the big deal in craft brewing is that you are less than 50% owned by a large company. Wicked Weed makes very good beer in Asheville, but they're not a craft or independent brewery. They're owned by Anheuser-Busch. InBev is the big name for Anheuser-Busch. And so there are lots of beer sales for Budweiser and Miller decrease each year, and they're seeing that revenue drop, and so they're purchasing small breweries like Wicked Weed and selling beer through there. Quite honestly, Wicked Weed makes some of the best sour beers I think you can find anywhere, even though they're owned by a large company. So that 8,000 places in the U.S. making beer breaks down between brew pubs, tap rooms, microbreweries, which would be, brew pub would be what Cyclops is, that almost all the beer that they make at Cyclops is sold at Cyclops. Regional breweries like Highlands is a good example in Asheville, sell most of their beer commercially. Those are regional producers. And the split is small brewers where most of the consumption of the product takes place on the premises where they were brewed. There, I finally am done.
Sounds
All right,
good.
all right, we're going to take a break. We ought to take a break.
Yeah. I think maybe we should go down to the lab and get some things set up, and then maybe I'll do my thing in the lab, and we'll just
Yeah.
stay down there.
We want to break. So the lab is tight quarters, but we'll get used to it. As you go in there, you have 4 taster cups that'll be your cups for the interim. They're over to the right-hand side. They're Sharpie markers, and there's white, it's not white butcher paper.
Lab mat.
Lab paper laid out. Identify what will be your 4 glasses and write your name. They're Pittman and Arrington have been identified. And we'll talk to you about
You're going to need, also, while you have the Sharpie, go ahead and label each of your 4 cups, 1, 2, 3, 4, so that when we're doing tastings, you know what's in what cup, because a lot of beers look alike. So we'll go down there. It is going to be, it's my lab, which is room 228, which is where we had our original meeting, but it's 1 floor now. If we go down the hall and go down the steps, it'll be the first door on the right, on the 2nd floor. So we'll go down there now.
It really takes a little more than a month to take a beer from start to finish, and so we're going to have to speed the process up in some ways, although what we're going to do now is done by almost all brewers. We're going to start your yeast growing in a little bit of wort. In fact, grab that can and hold it up so everyone can see, and tell me what your name is again. Shannon. So Shannon's holding a can of wort. So this is just sugar water from barley. And inside your box, in fact, Natalie, you can crack your box open. Go through your ingredients and you'll find a packet of, we'll all be using the same ale yeast. I don't think anyone has a different yeast, but you can look and see that. It's going to be a little white packet about this big. Yeah, go ahead and look in your Christmas box. Yes, we have that. You got your yeast packets out? All right.
Do they all, let's see, does anyone have a different yeast? Do they all say Y444 American Ale? Does anyone have something different on the back of it?
We have Y77 English Ale.
You got English Ale,
English.
English Ale, American Ale, American Ale.
So
Okay.
two different varieties. So this will be our growth tank for our yeast. Crack open the bottle and put in up to the 300 ml mark out of the wort that's present. There, you get the job of holding this and then...
Can we get this white thing over there?
Yeah, leave that white thing in there, that one.
You said 300?
Yeah, go to the 300 ml mark.
They're not going to put the whole can?
Oh, do we have a...
We got enough.
Yeah, you can do the whole can, but you're gonna,
Wait,
Yeah.
with the
They're trying not to
300?
let them out too much.
yeah, it'll be a little foamy, so you can,
So you want to like measure this right here with the 300?
yeah, so that the liquid is to the 300. You can end up doing the entire can.
Try it before.
It's got rough in there, with the phone.
Perfect.
There you go. We're like
This is the
If you're at all curious, you can take take that wort can and pour a little bit into a cup and taste it. It's going to taste super sweet. It won't taste anything like beer, but you're welcome to taste it. Yeah.
It's just very fuzzy.
All right, once you have at least 300 mils in there, shake your yeast packet, tear it open, and dump your yeast into the wort.
Oh, also. Okay.
It's not going to taste like beer. Yeah.
It tastes like wort.
You want to try it?
Open your yeast packet and add it to.
Yeah. Just because
All in yeast. I want you to notice how little that is. It's less than a teaspoon of yeast, and in 2 weeks you're going to have a cup of all right.
those two things for me
Set
actually
your
if I were to
Erlenmeyer
try
flask with the yeast in the wort onto the stir plate and plug the stir plate in. There should be a plug.
Dr. Aaron,
Yes.
what if it's a little right now that's like settling? Should I take some?
Yeah,
It's more.
you dumped it all in?
Oh, no.
Dump it all in. You know, if a little bit spills, no big deal.
I'm talking about this, like, no settling guy.
Did you explain how the stir plates work?
No, I haven't.
What do you want us to turn up?
I'm not doing that.
You guys start.
Hey, good job.
We turned it on and started.
Yeah, no, it's good, it is.
Circuits or?
So, inside your Erlenmeyer flask, there's a magnet with this Teflon coated. These stir plates are also have a magnet, and that magnet, the stir plate will turn, and you can get it to turn by and it's stirring, and that's going to bring your yeast into solution. Now, yeah, you can lay that on top.
So what?
So it's spinning about this fast. I don't know. It's probably 30% of the way to full.
It's at level 5.
Level 5.
Different stir plates.
Yeah, they're all slightly different.
Just want to have some motion in there.
Yeah, so put that airlock on top. So this is an airlock that we will fill with water up to about here so that carbon dioxide can bubble out, but the air from the room won't go back in. I mean, it's not the air from the room isn't a problem at all, but there's just bacteria in the air that will come back in, and we want to keep that at a minimum. So I'm stealing your glass.
This is Sadie solution.
Oh, perfect.
1 person.
Yeah, so one person from each group come up and get a little bit of this is water with a sanitizer in it, and now you have this. You can go ahead and come up. Pour until you get to, you can see that.
There's usually lines on there. You want to kind of be in between those 2 lines.
Okay, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going.
What thing?
You're going to pour your sanitizing solution in.
Oh,
So carbon dioxide is heavier than our air. So as it is created in there, it's going to stay at the bottom and slowly build up and push all the dirty air that's in there now out. And eventually that whole thing will just be carbon dioxide.
When yeast comes together, what's that called? Flocculation, yeah. So spin it a little bit.
I'm like, is this shit going on?
But the bottle like dented while I was reading it. Me too.
So you have there's a lot of.
I know nothing about beer too, so I'm excited to know what I'm actually going to be again.
Whenever I go to mountains, I'll have like, I'll try like juice that I have like in the store or whatever.
Yeah.
I really don't know like what goes into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just tired of watching sir. I wish I had one that I stole.
Where are you from?
I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina.
Charleston.
Charleston.
Spartanburg.
Spartanburg. Hey, not too far. Where you from, like?
Let's see.
Oh, Kentucky.
Yeah.
Oh, you're
So, outside West.
from Beaver?
Okay.
Oh, that's fun.
You're
Moved when I graduated.
racing country.
If you get going too fast, the magnets will unsync from each other and it'll just rattle around in there, so they have to turn it off and start it back slowly so they can sync back up.
Particularly if you are a PM group, I'm giving you this opportunity to label that so you can put Festivus Miracle or put everything like all of this, because we're going to have to move those out of the way.
Yeah, everybody should label their yeast. It's important when we have all these different groups with different ingredients and things, we need to know who's who. Guess it really doesn't matter as long as you get the English ales and the American ales separate. Yes, correct.
Move this.
Yeah, you can turn it off and sort of swish it around.
Now, pull back, pull off the airlock.
Yeah, you gotta take it. Hold on a second. Don't do that.
I looked everywhere and I was like, shit.
We gotta show them how to do it.
I guess I'm going 12.
How far to drive is that, like 7 hours?
Yeah, it's really not bad at all.
I've never been to Lexington.
Make a label that is what beer you're making. Oh, the Sierra Madre, excellent. Put Sierra Madre and take it all.
All right, so
On the tape first.
I want to show you how to properly take the airlock off, because there's a way to do this. We have 2 tools. I'll make up some more of these paper clips. But if you were just to pull the airlock off, it's going to suck that same solution in, which we don't want to do, really. So you need to come in and pop the top off, and then you can take this off. Because otherwise it's airtight and it will suck. It'll create suction and suck that in. So, yes, you want to switch that down?
Grab that.
Do y'all need to swish your thing around, or are you good?
Maybe.
good. Y'all need to take your airlock off and sort of get that yeast off the side.
Yes, everybody's seniors.
Yeah. Are you?
I did transfer here though. I used to get that.
When did you transfer?
About 2 years.
Yeah.
Oh,
Do what I'm saying, take the airlock off?
Yeah, you didn't walk into anything good.
Yeah, exactly. This is like the first year I've really like
Yeah.
to the fullest since like last year.
They're still kind of strict.
All right. So this is part 2 of your lecture today. I stole the good part. I had Dr. Arrington do the history stuff, and then I get to talk about different beer styles and give you some beer to taste. So I decided when we first started with doing this interim that I love interim. I think it's one of the best. You know that holiday song, Most Wonderful Time of the Year? That's interim for me. Especially when I'm doing something I love like this. So I decided that I was going to have themed shirts. I wasn't going to wear my normal suit and tie during interim. So today we are celebrating diversity, so we're talking about all the different types of beer styles. So you'll have to stay tuned to see what my shirt is each day. All right.
Did you get them made?
No, they're all commercially available. You see what you like. All right, so Dr. Arrington touched on this a little bit, that one of the primary distinctions in types of beer, styles of beer, well, all the ingredients play a role. The yeast plays a really important role because we have those two types of yeast, the lager yeast and the ale yeast, right? And that is immediately going to divide beers into two different camps, right? Am I a lager or am I an ale? There's a lot of subtypes within that, right? And even within the yeast, I'll show you some of the different types of yeast, but we have, even under ale, we'll have like West Coast ale, English ale, American ale that you guys use. There's a whole category of Belgian ales that have been developed. And then you can also have specialty yeast, like wild yeast. And yeast is very proprietary, the yeast that brewers use. In fact, who told us the story about going over to Europe and while they were touring a famous...
It was a brewer in Anderson.
A brewer in Anderson.
Yeah,
you heard that story.
he went into a Czech, I think, brewery, and they were down in the tunnels, and he took out a cotton swab and just ran it down the wall, and then tucked the cotton swab back into his test tube, and went through the tour and came back, and then he took that cotton swab with the little bit of yeast that just would have been on the wall, and brew that yeast up. I mean, mixing it a little bit at a time, and he had sort of
stolen their
corporate
yeast.
Espionage, taken the yeast that was just...
Yeah.
So yeast are fungus, and they're just in the air all around. Sourdoughs, you just make by collecting the yeast that are just in the atmosphere.
So once we have our yeast component that's sort of defining the style, then it's going to come down to the grain bill. That's the next sort of thing that defines style. And we have two sort of primary grains that are used. The barley that we talked about, but wheat and wheat beers, like Blue Moon is a wheat beer, is another category. And then there's a bunch of specialty ones that we'll sort of talk about. In fact, in talking about the wild yeast, how many people have had a sour beer before, right? Okay. So the reason it's sour is because it's been infected by another bacteria, and that's what creates the sour process. And you have to be very careful about that, because if that bacteria gets out of that batch and gets in the walls or the air, it can infect your entire brewery, and you'll never get rid of it. And in fact, there are breweries that have become sour breweries because they got infected, and they can only make sour beers in those buildings now. Sierra Nevada makes, what is it, Wild Little Thing? I don't know if anyone's had that. That's their sour. They have a separate building from their brewery that contains that bacteria, and there's a single pipe that only goes one way from that building into the fermenter where they're going to ferment that. And they're very, very careful about that, because they're a multi-million-dollar operation, right? That you can't to be very careful about. So, all right. Again, we touched on this a little bit, but primary differences between lagers and ales is that ales ferment at a warmer temperature. So here we see optimal temperature for these are all American ales. I mean, these are all ales. These are all Belgian ales. So as I mentioned, Belgian has its yeast, sorry. Whole separate category. And then they ferment anywhere from like 60 to 75 degrees, which is what we'll be doing, because we don't have the capability really to regulate our temperature during fermentation between 50 and 55, 60 degrees. That's for lagers. They have to have a colder temperature to work. Now people are being very creative. So as we said that there's malt houses that do the malting, There's also yeast production facilities, and that's what White Labs is. It's where we're going to go have lunch in Asheville and tour. They make hundreds, if not thousands, different types. Well, that's a question we need to ask: how many types of yeast do they produce? So there's companies that are making this and selling it to the breweries. Right? One of the yeast, lager yeast, that Dr. Arrington used recently is a new strain of yeast that's able to ferment at higher temperatures, and even though it's a lager yeast. All right. Yeast also, different strains of yeast. So if you're thinking about, okay, well, what kind of yeast am I going to pick for my beer? Well, one, it has to match the style. Two, different yeast strains have different alcohol tolerances, right? So if you want to make a super high gravity beer that's going to be 15%, right, then you need a special type of yeast. Most yeast tap out around 9%, right? So you don't typically see a lot of beers higher than 9% in ABV because you have to either use a special yeast or do a special process to bump the alcohol up to that.
Yeah, the alcohol that the yeast is producing kills off the yeast. So champagnes are 15%. Those are special yeast that can tolerate that high level of alcohol.
And in fact, when we make your meads, we're going to use a champagne yeast because meads are higher ABV. They'll probably be above 10%. All right, so in a nod to the chemist in the room, we have the periodic table of beer styles. And so this is organized sort of, it's like the periodic table. There's a key, there's a style number, there's a name. Down here in the left corner, we have the ABV range for that style. So styles have different ABVs. The IBUs is the way that we measure bitterness, the bitterness of beers. And we have a SRM, which is the color of the beer. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Up here we have the original and final gravity. And so we'll talk a lot about that. That's a chemistry-related thing. Do you want to handle that, just to let them know what those are?
We don't want to say too much about it right now, but so ABV, alcohol by volume, beers are in the 5% range, 5% alcohol of the total volume, 5% is alcohol. We calculate that by, if you have a lot of sugar gets converted into a lot of alcohol. If you have a lot of sugar, your original gravity, that's how dense the beer is higher. And so we estimate how much alcohol will be produced by the density of the wort. A high density wort has a high original gravity, and how much of that gets eaten, converted into alcohol, as that gravity drops, as the density drops, you can calculate exactly how much alcohol is being produced.
So that's what the original and final gravity. So once the beer is done fermenting, we can take another gravity measurement, and the difference between those is how much sugar got eaten, essentially, right? Which correlates to how much alcohol was produced. All right. Yeah, I think that's everything on that. I just want everyone to know. So a little bit more about alcohol strength. So here we see different ales, Belgian beers, and lagers, and sort of the range of their ABVs, right? So if you have imperial or double, if the beer says double or triple or imperial, that typically denotes a higher ABV style of that beer. So here we have the regular stout. Irish stout is a drier stout like Guinness. It's around 4%. Stouts generally are like 4 to 8%, and then above 8, you're getting into what we would call an imperial stout. Right? Bitterness, IBUs. This also shows you sort of where things rank. So a beer like Coors or Budweiser or Natty Light, it's going to have an IBU of like 10. Very low sort of bitterness component to it. When you start getting into the IPAs, the Indian Pale Ales, they're really known for the bitterness component. And so we're going to get in the 30 to 60 sort of range, right? And again, like the most sort of bitter beers, the highest flavor beers, usually Imperials, there might be in the 70 to 80 range. How does the beer become bitter?
One of the core ingredients does it.
Hops.
Hops. And so what makes a beer more or less bitter?
Leave it in there longer.
What's that?
They leave it longer.
Yes, it's how long they are in the boil. The length of the time in the boil is going to enhance that. If you put hops in with just 5 minutes to go, not much bitterness. A lot of flavor might come out of it, but not a lot of bitterness. If you do a 60-minute boil, a lot more bitterness is being extracted from that, right? Has anyone ever heard of Dogfish 60-minute IPA or Dogfish 90-minute IPA? That's how long they are boiling those hops, 60 minutes or 90 minutes. So the 90 minutes is going to be more bitter than the 60 minute. Yeah. You just raise your hand, you heard of it? Okay. All right, and then SRMs. Different beers have different stuff. So we talked about stouts having that dark color, whereas pilsners are going to be very light in the SRM. What creates the color of the beer?
Are you like roast the hops?
Yes, right? So whether or not you're using a dark malted, you've really kilned a lot and made that hop very dark. And not hop, malt, sorry, very dark, or whether it was just lightly kilned, and that's going to produce the lightest colored beers, right? So Cashmere Blonde, who's the Cashmere Blonde, right? Do y'all have a grain packet in your? It's probably very light grains. Look at the grains. They're not probably very dark. Festivus, do y'all have a grain packet? Yeah. So let me see.
That's a pretty good comparison.
So here's Festivus. Festivus is going to be a dark beer, right? A very dark beer. The Irish Red is you're going to get the red color from that grain packet, right? And then the blonde, hold the blonde up, grain, or very light compared to very dark, the blonde. Okay. That's a story. All right, so let's start with our lager family. And there's some, there's always unique elements in the periodic table. There's some unique beers in the beer world. And the first beer that you're going to taste is going to be a Kolsch. In fact, we could probably go ahead before that. Which is actually part of the Alt family. And I know that some of you are making an Alt beer with your 5-gallon batch. But a Kolsch really, I would say, is in the lager family, right? It's a lighter colored beer, lower
German light
quality.
beer, yeah.
German light beer, right?
So number one,
Number one is,
give yourself 3 fingers in number one.
all right, so do a pour about that big. Everybody's number one. And pass it on. You want to try it out for me?
Please.
There you go.
Are you a big juice person?
He's got
Yeah.
All right, so
It kind of tastes like that.
lagers, probably a lot of the beers that you guys are used to drinking are in the lager family probably. That's going to be your Budweisers, your Bud Lights, Michelob's, even some dark beers. So not all lagers aren't light colored SRMs. So things like Michelob Dark or Beck's Dark are still lagers, but they're using a darker grain bill to produce those. All right. What else to say about that? So as Dr. Arrington mentioned, the birthplace, sort of historical place of lagers was in the Czech, was sort of that first lager that was made. But Germany really owned it within those 10 years, and most German beers are lagers, which is what a Kolsch is. So this is going to have not a lot of hop. It's going to be pretty mild on the hop flavor. You do have a little bit of bitterness in that. Let me go back to the Kolsch. So we're looking at a 20 to 30 IBU in this. The alcohol range is right in that 5%. And the SRM is very light, 4 to 5 on the SRMs, right? Not a whole lot of aroma from it. You smell it because hops give a lot of the aroma to the beer, and it doesn't have a big hop aspect. We'll taste a hazy IPA in a minute. That'll have a big aroma flavor. And you might want to save like a little bit of the Kolsch so that you can sort of compare the different styles of beer. All right, so the history of lager beer in the U.S. is that Bavarian John Wagner brought the lager yeast over to the colonies, to Philadelphia in 1840. And there's actually a historical marker where he had his first brewery, right? And some of the differences between the ingredients in America and in Europe was the type of barley that was grown. They have 2-row barley in Europe, but in America, most of the barley was 6-row barley. And so, in comparing these, he's trying to replicate the German beer. It was coming out a lot thicker, so they started to add some adjuncts like corn and rice to sort of lighten that up. So I don't know if you all have seen the big marketing campaign last year by Budweiser, where all their cases of beer said, like, corn, what did it say on it? Right? Barley, rice, yeast, and water, hops.
Yeah, rice was on there, which was...
That's an ingredient, right? Because that's a primary component in Budweiser. Rice is a lot cheaper than malted barley.
It's super light.
And it's super light.
Yeah, if you want a light-looking beer, get your sugar some rice to do it.
Dr. Eaton mentioned, during Prohibition, the big breweries switched over to producing other things. And so when Prohibition finally ended, they were pretty much ready to go. They still had the equipment, they still had the workers, the recipes, all of that. And so there were really only a handful of breweries sort of survived that. And Yuengling is the oldest craft brewery in America. And
And largest, too, I think.
the largest, what did we say that is? But all of these Coors, Anheuser-Busch, Pabst, Rose, all of those were the big lager ones. So coming out of Prohibition, right, pretty much all you could get were lager style beers, right? I will say Budweiser, I'm not a huge fan, but it just doesn't, it has its unique flavor profile, I guess. But it is probably the quintessential American beer. There's more Budweiser sold in America than any other single beer. For sure.
It would be very hard to reproduce that beer. It is a testament to their quality control that they can make that the same thing every time.
Yes. And I've looked into, and they're also very corporate, very big business. I've looked into trying to get us a tour of a Budweiser facility just to see the sheer size and magnitude of it, and they just don't do that. Like, every other brewery is like, yeah, we'll give you a tour. We want to come show off our process and show off what we do. All right, so they have 2 places they get their hops. Bonners Ferry, Indiana grows their hops, and Hallertau, Germany grows their hops. But their ingredients have rice also in there. One of the big things that makes Budweiser, and the reason other people can't copy Budweiser exactly, is their yeast. It is the same yeast strain that Adolphus Busch used in 1837. It's exactly the same, and nobody else knows what that yeast is or has access to that, presumably. In fact, they store the yeast in 2 different locations, at their facility in St. Louis and at their headquarters, the InBev headquarters. So a little bit of history. InBev is a big beverage company, worldwide beverage company that bought Anheuser-Busch a couple of years ago. So they stored it in both of these places in case there's a disaster or catastrophe at one, they won't lose the yeast. The two opposite sides of the world, presumably nothing would happen to both places at the same time. It's stored in St. Louis in a 3-story brick windowless building. Only 5 people have key card access to that building. They're inside the building. The yeast is stored in 5 cryogenic tanks. There's only 1 key that fits to open those tanks. Right? Every week, they take a milliliter of yeast, just like you guys had, a small little quantity of yeast, and put it into wort like you guys just did, and they grow that yeast, right? So that's what the yeast is doing. It's just multiplying, right, as it's doing its thing making beer for us. And they scale that 1 milliliter of yeast up to produce 100 barrels of just yeast. So they put it in a big 2,000 barrel fermenter. How many barrel fermenters is the RJ Rockers?
60.
60. So those big fermenters at RJ Rockers, that's 60 barrels. This is 2,000 barrels. Much, much bigger scale, right? And they let all that yeast flocculate, and they don't care about the beer that's being made. They want the yeast at the bottom of the cone, and that's what they pull off, and they put into 100 barrels. And then they ship that every Monday to 30 barrels to facilities in Spain, Italy, Ireland, and Argentina. And the other 50 barrels are used in their production facilities across the United States. So that's how important yeast is. Really, real important. Okay. Moving on to the ale family. And this is probably where we need to do the Gosa. Gosa is a sort of specialty beer as well, but it can kind of be thought about in this family here of the lambic family. These are all kind of sour-ish beers, and it's a wheat beer. It's made with wheat instead of barley. So all of these are also called white beers or Weiss beers, if it's in German. And that means that they're coming from wheat, and primarily wheat instead of primarily barley. I like almost every style of beer except sours, but I tolerate it. Dr. Arrington, on the other hand, likes almost every style of beer except wheat. Pour and go that way with us. So these wit beers or Weiss beers, again, all that means is that it's wheat beer or white beer. A lot of wheat beers use specialized yeast strains, particularly those Belgian yeast strains, in order to produce those flavors, those sour flavors, right? You may also see terms of styles with double and triple, and again, that's the double and triple is referring to the ABV of that and the strength, sort of the flavor of those beers. All right, so pretty different than the Kolsch.
Hey, can you pass it?
So pretty sour, not a lot of hops, not a lot of bitterness, right? Very low bitterness, very low hops. So we're looking at IBUs now, anywhere from 3 to 5. The Belgian ales are going to have that bitterness component to them, whereas the wheat beers and the lambic sour ales are not going to have that hoppiness to them. All right, so show of hands, how many people like the Gosa? or sour people. All right. There's nothing wrong with not liking a beer, but you gotta, we want you to be educated about why you don't like it, right? And to have tried it, and to know that. Did I miss somebody? Hey. All right. Yeah, when we're in here, that's a good point. When we're in here brewing, because we're going to try and keep the door shut, because one, it's going to smell like a brewery. But I'll unlock that door so that y'all can come in and out that door without having to use the key code every time you come in and out. So. Okay. Pale ales. And this is probably where we want to do the hazy. Come as fast.
This highway that you're getting is from Oscar Blues. Oscar Blues is a really fun brewery in Brevard. If you want to do something cool over the weekend, Oscar Blues is a great sort of regional brewery, but just up in Brevard.
I would second that. That is a very good brewery to do.
Where is that?
In Brevard, North Carolina.
Actually, really? Yeah, my cousin.
Sierra Nevada is, of course, a wonderful brewery to go to, but you've got to make reservations practically right now. Oscar Blues is
If you're up in that neck of the woods, another one that I'll mention is Bull Rock Cidery. They also have a lot of craft brews, the local craft brews on tap, in addition to their ciders. And we'll talk a little bit about ciders and how they're different from beers. All right, so this one, now, if you smell it, you're going to smell the hops first, right?
Okay.
This is technically an Indian pale ale, but this new craze, fad, if you will, in the brewing world, to make these hazy beers, sort of came out of New England. And I'll talk about that in a second. Let me go ahead and cover this. So, differences between a pale ale and an IPA are going to be the IBUs and the color. Pale ales are going to be more hop forward. They're going to have more of a less bitterness and more of just the aroma and flavor of the hops. Whereas the IPAs are going to have more of that bitterness. The first IPA was brewed by George Hodgson's Bow Brewing. It was named an IPA because it was located near the docks where the boats from East India were going, and so his beer was getting shipped on those boats out to the colonies in India, and they created the IPA so that it would have more hops and have more of the preservative nature so that it would last longer on the long trips to India that we're going over there. As I mentioned before, double IPAs or imperial IPAs are going to have more flavor, more bitterness, and more ABV in it. So the hazy beer, so if you look at this, you can see that it's hazy, right? Especially compared to, well, the other ones, especially the Goza, right? And it also has a different mouthfeel, so it's more smooth, almost like a thickness to the IPA. And that comes from the water chemistry. And so these beers originated in New England, where, I always get this wrong, the water's very hard.
Lots of calcium.
Lots of calcium in there. So if you want to make a hazy IPA in Spartanburg, you're going to have to put calcium chloride into your water to get the water profile that will create that mouthfeel. That mouthfeel is the calcium in the beer that you're tasting. Right? All right, now we're getting into sort of the beers that I really like, which are the stronger Scottish and English ales. And so the bitters, there's a brewery in Asheville called Green Man. They specialize in their sort of flagship beer. It's called an ESB, which is a extra special bitter beer. From ESB, and it's categorized by having a little bit lower carbonation, but very high ABV and strong bitterness, obviously. It's called extra special bitter, right? The Scottish beers are going to have less IBUs, and they're going to have more sweetness to them, right? So how do you get sweetness in a beer? How are we making beer? What are the yeast doing? Yeah, they're converting the sugar in the wort into beer, right? If you want a beer to be sweet, you need to put non-fermentable sugars in that beer, sugars the yeast can't eat. Remember there were two sugars that Dr. Arrington said the yeast could eat? Glucose and sucrose, and they're really small, but if you put those long-chain sugars in there, the beer will taste sweeter because that hasn't fermented out. That also means that they're going to have a higher final gravity because you're going to have a bunch of sugar left in there, right, that is not going to be fermented. All right. Browns and porters. Browns and porters are the difference between those are very, very similar beers. Browns sometimes have a more nutty sort of flavor to them, and they're a little bit lighter in color, whereas porters have a little bit more of an edge, like a roast to them, and they're a little bit darker, but very similar. And categorizing a beer as a brown or a porter is sort of a tricky thing. A lot of them could go sort of either way. And in fact, the difference between a brown porter and a robust porter was pretty arbitrary. The two people, I don't think you mentioned Michael Jackson. Did you mention Michael Jackson? Yeah. Charlie Pazian and Michael Jackson are the sort of foremost experts on home brewing, and they were the ones that were who created the first craft brewing and home brewing competitions, and were the judges, and they sort of created these categories to say, hey, if a porter is really on the high end of everything a porter should be, we're going to call it robust. And if it's more towards the brown ale side, we're going to call it a brown porter. All right. Yeah, so these beers, a lot of the ales, as Dr. Arrington mentioned earlier, had pretty much died out. It was only with the sort of revival of microbrewing and home brewing in the 80s that we started to see a variety of these different types of beers being produced again. They were made a long time ago, when pre-prohibition, when most of the brewing was in regional or citywide breweries. Caramel chocolate flavors, nutty flavors, a lot of flavor profile going on in there, right? I wouldn't make a Krispy Kreme lager. I'm going to make a Krispy Kreme porter, right? Or stout, because that's going to have those flavors are going to match with that. All right, and that brings us to stouts. Stouts were primarily what was being brewed back in England in those Middle Ages, and they were considered nourishing. They were safe to drink. They had a lot of calories in them, so they used a lot of non-fermentable sugars like lactose to give them a sweet taste. And it wasn't really until Guinness started making their beer that stouts got drier. They lost sort of that sweetness, and they sort of introduced that dry Irish version of that, where it doesn't have any lactose or oatmeal. I guess we should do these. We need the bottle of
So stouts may not be your favorite, but I want you to taste this stout and don't think of it as a beer. Think of it as a red wine. Let it sit in your mouth. It will coat your mouth. And if you take away from this class an appreciation for stouts, you will have made my day.
Oh, really? I've never had
So you can obviously you can taste the sweetness. Stouts also tend to have a bitter component to them as well. I mean, they cannot have a bitter component, it just depends. This particular one has more. And a couple of things I want to point out about this particular type of beer. It's made by Left Hand Brewing Company, which they're kind of known for stouts. That's sort of their jam. Like every brewery kind of has their thing that they do well. This is a milk stout. It's called a milk stout, not because it has milk in it, although it does have sort of a creamy flavor profile. But it has milk sugar, lactose, which is not fermentable. So when you're making your beer, if you want to make a sweet beer, we're going to add lactose to that, right? Cyclops Brewery in town, traditionally, they've moved a little bit away from this because they had a change in their head brewer. But the original brewer was really into lactose. I mean, almost all their stuff had some kind of lactose in the beer, right? Yes, sir.
Is the nitro like coffee or?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Okay.
I'm enjoying my stuff too much. The other thing I wanted to talk about is you'll notice that it says nitro on it, right? So typically when beers are carbonated, what are they carbonated with? Carbon dioxide, right? Except nitro beers are carbonated with nitrogen, right? Instead of carbon dioxide. And that gives a different mouthfeel. The gas bubbles in that. And typically, if you look on the bottles, on the back side it has a little thing, it's upside down. But it says hard pour, and we weren't able to do that because of the tasting, but what you're really supposed to do is pop the top and basically dump the beer in an oversized cup, and that will activate the nitrogen, and it produces this cascading effect. So if you've ever had a Guinness beer and you see that foam, that's not poured wrong. You have to actually wait and let the beer settle, because that's all the little tiny bubbles that are smaller than carbon dioxide that are coming out of that, and it imparts a different mouthfeel. Carbon dioxide can almost, if you have an over-carbonated beer, it's going to have a bite to it. There's a not a bitterness, but like a mouthfeel bite of the carbon dioxide. And this is very the opposite.
That was a good
It's
idea.
very smooth.
Is that why, like, in the Guinness,
Yes, so in the cans of Guinness, what's different than this is when you get a can of Guinness, it will do that nice cascading effect, and you don't have to do a hard pour. You can do a very slow pour because it has a thing in there called a widget. You want to talk about a widget? I don't know that much about it.
It's just a piece of plastic that's pressurized with nitrogen, and when you pop the top, the pressure inside the can and the widget are the same. As soon as you open the top, then the pressure of the widget is greater than the pressure around it that erupts.
And releases the nitrogen freshly into the beer, right? So if you go somewhere and get a Guinness on tap, that brewery has a special canister of nitrogen that's hooked up to that particular tap, and often the nitrogen taps are conical. They look different than the other taps in the tap room, and that is to handle that, is to reduce
the early release of that nitrogen to have it be released in the glass as it's poured. And in fact, Guinness, someone may do their project on Guinness, but bartenders have to be like certified to pour a Guinness, and there's a certain, not a lot of bars actually do it this way, but there's a technical way that Guinness wants you to pour their beers.
Yeah, if one person at the table orders a Guinness and everyone else orders something else, the Guinness will be the last thing to come out. It takes a while to pour it correctly.
The Imperial Stout, we have an Imperial Stout. We also have a Russian Imperial Stout. And Catherine the Great in 1780 was one of the empresses in Russia, commissioned, she wanted a stout that was even more than an Imperial Stout. And so it was an extra strong and barrel-aged version of stout that was shipped to her from Burton Ale, and that then created this new sort of category of Russian Imperial Stout. Now, we mentioned that beer was shipped in casks and in barrels, but lately in particular, another take on beer styles is to take a regular style beer and age it in a barrel that has had something else previously in it. And so if it's a dark beer or maybe even an IPA, a lot of those are done in whiskey or bourbon barrels. And a lot of breweries, that's a big thing to go find, to be able to get those barrels from Buffalo Trace or from wherever. If it's a lighter colored beer, or if it's a sour, sometimes those will be aged in wine barrels. Different types of wine barrels, and those impart different tastes. And New Groove, who's been a New Groove? One person, I think it said they've done it. Yes. All right. New Groove, that's sort of their jam. Their sort of thing is barrel aging. When we go there, you will see 20, 30 barrels, right? When we go to Cyclops, they may have 3 or 4, right? So that's sort of the thing that they do with big, boozy, barrel-aged beers. All right. All right, so that's sort of, and like Dr. Aaron said, we will post PDFs of our slides. But this is a great slide if you are wanting to try a beer and you're like, hey, what's a Bohemian Pilsner? You can look and see, okay, it's going to have a medium sort of ABV, medium IBUs, but very light in color, right? So that you can sort of see where these different styles line up and how they influence. The last thing I want to mention is that different glasses, the glassware can actually matter in the quality and flavor of the beer, right? So what kind of glasses do they have at Pint Night at Delaney's? Which one?
The mug.
This one, right? Why do they have this one? They're inexpensive and they're easy to store. You can stack them all together, right? Can't stack stiffers together, right? You can't stack a tulip glass together. They take a lot more space in a bar. So if a bar is concerned with mass quantity serving, you got your pint glass, right? Your, Applebee's or whatever, you won't get your pint glass. But these other ones are actually 4 different styles. So a sniffer, as the name sort of mentions, is going to enhance the volatiles, the chemicals being released from that, to give you a different aroma take that you're going to lose in a pint glass, right? Tulip also does that, but it also induces large foamy heads. And so having that foamy head is not necessarily a bad thing. It helps, again, release aromas and changes the flavor. The Weissens, the Hefeweizens, are wheat beers that use a special yeast to give it that banana clove sort of taste to that Hefeweizen. And they actually have a special glass that the head in this glass, they want you to have head because it sort of holds those flavors in. And as you tip the glass back to drink, the head rolls back and the beer comes under, and it's the shape of the glass that does that for that beer. Whereas if you have a pint glass, you're not getting that you're drinking the foam off of there, you're not getting the beer from underneath. Pilsner, again, we don't really care. It's kind of like a glorified pint glass because there's no real aroma in Pilsners. We want something that you can see the clarity of that beer, right? And then Belgians, goblets, flutes, again, are sort of to enhance carbonation and sort of show off that beer, right? So as you become a beer aficionado this month, you'll be able to correctly serve beers in the right glasses if you choose to do that. All right. I think that's all we got for today. Do we have any notes for tomorrow?